I think a lot about where our historical method comes from. And a lot of it we trace back to that great sociologist, Ibn Khaldun,
Mm,
who's writing even before that. So he's writing in the end of the Middle Ages, what Westerners call the Middle Ages. So he's writing even before the Renaissance. And he's saying the only way you can make sense of the past is by looking at those events against the context that they belong in. Don't separate them out. Ibn Khaldun, in his Muqaddimah, is very clear about this.
from what I see coming from people who tend to be on the more religious side, they have a certain amount of disdain for the source critical method or the historical critical method. But so to begin with, first I would like to know what is the difference between the two, the source critical method and the historical critical method, if there is any, because sometimes I see people using them interchangeably, but I notice that you're very specific in the term you use for the methodology you use. And how does this approach differ from those used by theologians and religious jurists when trying to understand the past?
I just want to, I guess, make a point clear. You said you talked about the approach being different than those who were religious. I am religious. I
Okay.
believe, I believe absolutely, without doubt, in my God and in my prophet. And
Yeah,
I have the greatest fondness for my prophet, the same fondness you have for him.
definitely,
Perhaps
definitely.
why I feel a special responsibility when I approach his life to try and make true statements about his life. Um, I can't love a man and say I am his follower if I'm then going to believe perhaps mythology about him that doesn't make sense to me as a scholar. So it's my love and admiration for our holy prophet, peace be upon him, that drives me to want to make true statements about him.
Definitely.
So what does that constitute? Well, a historian, and I am a historian, often uses the phrase a historical critical method. And they put it into an abbreviation, HCM, historical critical method. But I didn't start out as a historian. I started out as a classicist.
Mm,
And so I started out, in fact, with uh, Greek and Roman history. And we don't have um, we don't have any ability to go back in the past in a time machine. I've loved the past since I was a child. As a boy, I used to dress up as a Viking or as a Roman legionnaire as a little kid, and I just love the past. I love the fact that we came from somewhere, and that's something that we came from we can still read about because those people left us sources. And so, as a classicist, I use the term source critical method because it's the historians that have taken over that method from the classicists who call it the historical critical method. Effectively, it's the same thing. The phrase I use, though, I think talks more specifically about the sources and the criticism of the sources.
mm.
And by criticism, what I mean is by critique, interrogation of sources. That sits at the heart of the activity. Whereas the phrase historical critical method just seems to imply that historians have a critical method of understanding the past that might or might not be relating to sources.
Mm.
So, as a classicist, I prefer the old fashioned phrase, the source critical method, because that's what I do. I get a source and I have to say, who produced this source? Who wrote it? Why did they write it? Upon what evidence did they base this source? What were they reading themselves? What had they seen themselves? And so that critique of the sources, how true might it be? Is it that they're writing uh, for a future audience to put forward a vantage point that will be beneficial to for their reputation and future generations? These sorts of questions. And so when you go back to the past, for example, when you read the Gallic Wars by Julius Caesar, written supposedly just before well, shortly before he died, you've got big questions about the fact that Caesar wrote his own memoirs.
Mm.
And so here you have Caesar writing in the third person, saying, oh, and then Caesar marched upon the Iceni or whoever, and then Caesar did this and Caesar did that. Well, that raises great questions about objectivity, his own objectivity. He's saying what a great leader he is, what a great military genius he is. So when you read these things, you have to kind of say, well, why is he telling us that? What might he not be telling us? What kind of bias is involved in his presentation of his evidence? And so you learn that as a classicist. You learn it about, you've got Alexander the Great, the kind of the founder of what we call Hellenism, the later Hellenistic writers, proud of that heritage, that history, writing about this Alexander the Great. Well, that's a Greek or Hellenistic perspective of Alexander. The Persians didn't find him terribly great. No. And so, again, there's bias there. And so this method that we have developed, I guess it comes from the Renaissance. The Renaissance, as you know, means the rebirth. 1480-ish to 1680-ish of the Common Era, after the Middle Ages. These Italian city-states in particular, but then the German city-states as well, and then the British and others, they start to develop a fascination for the classical world, and they re-engage with those sources. And that's where really this kind of source critical method takes off, is in the Renaissance. In the Renaissance, they're trying to rediscover the classical world and its greatness. And they're trying to reimagine that and remodel their own societies based on the ancient world, based on the Greeks and the Romans, based on their sources. And that then spills forward into what we call the early modern period, or the age of enlightenment, the age of reason, 1680, something like that, to around 1800. Where a degree of rationality is then applied to human endeavor, human activity, and human history, where we're finally stopped saying God did it, and we're saying humans did it. And so we begin to look at what's called agency. Who makes things happen? Because if it's not necessarily God's unfolding story, but it's the story of a human community or human peoples or human leaders, then this rationality that's brought to bear on the past begins to transform the study of history. In the same way, at this period, we get the development of the scientific method, the modern scientific method. But actually, I think a lot about where our historical method comes from. And a lot of it we trace back to that great sociologist, Ibn Khaldun, who's writing even before that. So he's writing in the end of the Middle Ages, what Westerners call the Middle Ages. So he's writing even before the Renaissance. And he's saying the only way you can make sense of the past is by looking at those events against the context that they belong in. Don't separate them out. Ibn Khaldun, in his Muqaddimah, is very clear about this. The way to make sense of what a people did at a particular time is to understand that region, understand that time. Why did people do things the way they did? And so, as well as being in some ways the father of sociology, we owe an awful lot to Ibn Khaldun for the profession of history.
Definitely.
And people often don't think about that. Jump forward to the 1800s and you come to what Western historians call the father of modern historiography, a man called von Ranke, Leopold von Ranke, who was a German. And he said that history, the profession of history wasn't to criticize or judge the past, that it wasn't about learning lessons for the future. It wasn't about something as simple as that. It was about learning how the past actually was. And he said that the past could be reconstructed. He said in German, wie es eigentlich gewesen, how it actually happened. And that implies that you can reconstruct the past with a degree of accuracy, something akin to what you would see if you went back in a time machine. So, what
And you,
is Ranker talking about? He's talking about a strict empiricism, that is evidence. Evidence is everything. And von Ranke says that there are qualities of sources, and sources can include obviously archaeology. It can include things like epigraphy, the study of inscriptions. It can include things like the study of coins. It can involve the study of graveyards and gravestones and inscriptions and graves. But primarily, it
did,
involves the written documents that the past leaves, primary and secondary sources.
did our